Every time you drink a glass of water, you are trusting an invisible system you almost never think about. Filters, treatment plants, chemistry, pipes and pumps and inspectors, all of it working silently, around the clock, to keep something deadly out of the glass in your hand. You turn a tap and clean water comes out, and you don't give it a second thought. It is one of the great quiet miracles of the modern world, but your ancestors had none of it. No filters, no treatment plants, no science, and, crucially, no way to even see the thing in the water that could kill them. For almost the entire history of our species, the water that kept people alive was also one of the most dangerous things they put in their bodies, and they were fighting that danger completely blind. And yet, here you are, which means they won. Generation after generation, drinking from rivers and ponds, and puddles and streams, our ancestors survived long enough to become us. So how did they do it? How do you defeat an enemy you can't see, don't understand, and have no tools to fight? The answer is one of the most underrated survival stories in all of human history. And here's the thing, nobody tells you. They beat this invisible killer over and over for thousands of years without ever once knowing it existed. So let's start with the enemy itself, because to appreciate how clever the solutions were, you have to understand just how terrifying the problem was. The water in a clear, cool stream looks perfectly safe. It looks clean, and that is exactly what makes it so dangerous. Because the things that make water deadly are, almost always, completely invisible. Bacteria, parasites, microscopic organisms that cause diseases like cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and a dozen other killers. A single mouthful of contaminated water, looking no different from safe water, could carry enough of these invisible passengers to kill a healthy adult within days through relentless, dehydrating sickness. And here's the cruel part. The main way these diseases spread is through human and animal waste getting into water, which means the very thing that often contaminated the water was invisible, tasteless, and odorless, mixed into a substance. People had no choice but to drink, several times a day, every single day, for their entire lives. You cannot stop drinking water. You can only hope the water you drink doesn't kill you. For most of human history, this was simply a fact of life. Waterborne disease was one of the greatest killers our species ever faced, quietly taking more lives over the millennia than every war in history combined. And our ancestors faced it without germ theory, without microscopes, without any idea that tiny living things even existed. They could not see the enemy. But, remarkably, they could learn to outwit it. And they did it in several brilliant ways. The first line of defense required no tools at all, just the senses and hard-won wisdom about how to read water. Over countless generations, humans became expert water readers. They couldn't see bacteria, but they learned, through brutal trial and error, to recognize the signs that came with it. The most important lesson was about movement. Flowing water, a fast stream tumbling over rocks, was generally safer than still water. And there's real logic to this, even though our ancestors couldn't have explained it. Moving water is more oxygenated, less likely to be a breeding ground for stagnation, and constantly being refreshed from upstream. A stagnant pond, by contrast, sitting warm and still in the sun, was a perfect incubator for dangerous growth. So a deep, ancient instinct took hold across human cultures. Prefer running water, distrust the still. They learned to use smell. A foul or off smell was a warning, a sign that something had died upstream, or that the water was rotting. They learned to use taste, cautiously, sampling and spitting. They learned to use their eyes, not just for clarity, but for the life around the water. Was there green growth, healthy plants, frogs, insects, a sign of a living, balanced system? Or was it eerily lifeless? And one of the cleverest tricks of all, watch the animals. If the local animals, the deer, the birds, the other mammals, drank regularly from a certain source and stayed healthy, that was powerful evidence. The water was probably safe. Animals had their own finely tuned instincts, and our ancestors learned to read them as a guide. The watering hole that the healthy herd returned to day after day was a watering hole you could probably trust. In a world with no laboratories, the behavior of wildlife was the closest thing to a water quality report you could get. And there's one more piece of water reading wisdom. That turned out to be one of the most important of all. Our ancestors learned, again through hard experience, that where the water came from mattered enormously. And the safest water often wasn't sitting out in the open at all. It was underground. Think about a natural spring, water bubbling up fresh from deep in the earth, or water drawn from a well dug down to the hidden water table below. This water is dramatically safer than a pond or a river, and there's a beautiful reason why. One our ancestors benefited from, long before they could explain it. As water soaks down through layers of soil, sand, and rock to reach the water table, the earth itself filters it, naturally, over and over. The ground strains out sediment and traps many contaminants on the way down. And because it's buried, that groundwater is protected from the surface filth, the waste, the runoff, the rotting matter, that poison open water. So a spring or a well wasn't just convenient. It was, in effect, water that the planet had already filtered for you. Humans who learned to dig down to reach it, rather than relying on whatever sat on the surface, gained access to some of the cleanest water available anywhere. The simple act of digging a well may have saved more lives, quietly, than almost any other ancient invention. People couldn't have told you about natural filtration through soil. They just knew that the water from the deep well somehow didn't make them sick the way the river did. And that was enough to build a civilization on. So that's the first defense. Reading the water and the world around it to choose the safest source. But humans didn't stop at choosing. They learned to actively make water safer. And here is where it gets genuinely impressive. Let's start with the single most powerful tool our ancestors ever found against waterborne disease: fire. Boiling water is, even today, one of the most effective ways to make it safe. The heat kills the bacteria and parasites that cause disease. And boiling, or heating water, is an ancient practice going back thousands of years, appearing in some of the oldest medical and practical writings humanity has left behind. Now, here's the beautiful part. Our ancestors had absolutely no idea why it worked. They could not have told you about killing microorganisms because they didn't know microorganisms existed, but they noticed the result. Water that had been boiled and cooled tended to make people sick less often. That was enough. The observation survived, even though the explanation was completely missing. They were running a life-saving technology on top of a total mystery, simply because they had watched and remembered and passed it on. Then there's filtration, and the independent ingenuity here is remarkable. All over the ancient world, in cultures that had no contact with each other, humans arrived at the same basic idea. If you pour dirty water through the right materials, it comes out cleaner. The ancient Egyptians, thousands of years ago, used sand and gravel to filter their water and even depicted water-clarifying methods on the walls of tombs. They also used a substance called alum, which causes tiny suspended particles to clump together and sink, clearing the water, a technique so effective that a version of it is still used in modern water treatment plants today. Ancient texts from India describe filtering water through sand and charcoal, boiling it, and exposing it to sunlight. The Greek physician Hippocrates designed a simple cloth filter, a bag that water was poured through to strain out impurities, still sometimes called the Hippocratic sleeve. And here's my favorite example, because it shows just how universal this ingenuity was. Far across the ocean, completely cut off from all of those cultures, the ancient Maya, at the city of Palenque, carved local limestone into porous cylinders and used them as water filters. The principle was strikingly similar to ceramic water filters we still use today. Different continent, different millennium, no contact whatsoever, and yet the same fundamental human insight. Push the water through something that catches what you don't want. Now, I have to be honest here, the way this channel always tries to be. Most of these filtration methods had a real limitation. Sand and cloth and gravel are brilliant at removing the visible stuff. Sediment, dirt, debris, larger parasites, and their eggs. And removing those things genuinely did reduce some diseases and made water far more pleasant. But the smallest, deadliest culprits, the bacteria themselves, were often too tiny to be caught by a simple sand filter. So filtration helped, sometimes a great deal, but it was not a complete shield. Our ancestors were winning battles, but the invisible enemy was still landing blows. The clear water from the filter could still, sometimes, carry death. There was also a quieter trick, so simple it's easy to overlook. Letting water sit. Our ancestors learned to collect water in large pots and vessels and allow it to stand undisturbed. Over hours, the heaviest dirt and sediment would slowly sink to the bottom, and the clearer water near the top could be carefully poured off. It wasn't perfect, but settling was a free, effortless way to improve water with nothing but patience and a container. In some cultures, people kept water in vessels made of specific materials, like certain metals, that we now know can actually have mild antibacterial effects, another solution that worked for reasons no one understood. And then there's the grandest strategy of all. If your local water is dangerous, don't fix it, replace it. Bring clean water from somewhere far away. This is the logic behind some of the most jaw-dropping engineering of the ancient world. The Romans built their famous aqueducts to carry fresh water, often from distant mountain springs, across enormous distances into their cities, using nothing but the careful, precise pull of gravity over miles of stonework. Even more astonishing, in some ways, were the qanats, an ingenious system developed in ancient Persia over 3,000 years ago. Qanats were gently sloping tunnels, dug by hand deep into the earth, that tapped into mountain groundwater and carried it for kilometers underground, to emerge, fresh and protected, at a settlement in the dry lowlands. Because the water traveled underground the whole way, it stayed cool and shielded from contamination. These systems were so effective that tens of thousands of them are still in use, across dozens of countries today, thousands of years later. Think about the scale of that ambition. Rather than risk the foul water nearby, entire civilizations chose to move mountains of earth to bring clean water to themselves, tunneling through hillsides and laying stone across valleys, all to outrun an enemy they still could not see. That is not the behavior of a helpless or primitive people. That is engineering on an epic scale, driven by a problem. They understood in its effects even when they couldn't name its cause. Which brings us to perhaps the most surprising solution of all, the one that turned the problem on its head. If the water itself was dangerous, what if you didn't drink the water? What if you turned it into something else first? Here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind. How did entire civilizations, packed into cities, surrounded by water they couldn't fully trust, manage to keep their populations hydrated and alive? And a huge part of the answer is fermentation. For much of human history, one of the safest things you could drink wasn't plain water. It was beer and wine. Not the strong stuff we think of today, but weak, watery, low-alcohol drinks consumed by ordinary people, sometimes including children, throughout the day. This sounds shocking to modern ears, but it wasn't about getting drunk, it was about staying alive. Because the process of making these drinks, it turns out, made them safer than the water they were made from. Think about how beer is made. A crucial step involves boiling the water, and we already know what boiling does, even though they didn't. On top of that, the fermentation process itself and the mild alcohol it produces creates an environment that is hostile to many of the dangerous organisms that thrive in plain water. The result was a beverage that was, in many cases, genuinely less likely to make you sick than the local water supply. So, across the ancient world, fermented drinks became a daily staple, a workaround for the water problem that humans stumbled into, long before they understood a word of the science. They didn't know they were boiling out bacteria or creating a hostile environment for pathogens. They just knew that the people who drank the small beer seemed to fare better than the people drinking straight from the questionable well. And so an entire dietary habit, woven deep into countless cultures, was in part an unconscious public health measure. Humanity was practicing disease prevention without having any concept of disease. So let's pull this together. Faced with an invisible, deadly enemy they could not see or understand, our ancestors built layer upon layer of defense. They learned to read water with their senses and to trust the wisdom of animals. They learned to boil it with fire. They independently invented filtration on continents that never met, and they learned to transform dangerous water into safer drinks through fermentation. Not one of these solutions came from understanding the true enemy. Every single one came from patient observation, from noticing what kept people alive, and from passing that hard-won knowledge down across generations. And yet, for all this ingenuity, I don't want to leave you with the impression that our ancestors had truly solved the problem. They hadn't. They had only blunted it. The honest, sobering truth is that waterborne disease remained one of the great killers of humanity, right up until very recent times, and it fell hardest on the smallest and most vulnerable. Children paid the steepest price. A baby or a young child with a small body and a developing immune system is terribly fragile in the face of the dehydrating illnesses that contaminated water causes. For most of human history, a staggering number of children did not survive their early years, and unsafe water was one of the leading reasons why. Every clever trick, the boiling, the filtering, the fermenting, the well digging, reduced the death toll. None of it stopped it. Families lived with the constant, grinding loss of children to an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't fully defeat. The wisdom they accumulated was real, and it saved countless lives. But it was wisdom written in an ongoing tragedy. They were holding back a flood with their bare hands, and they knew, in their grief, if not in their science, that the water kept getting through. But there's a final twist to this story, and it's a dark and ironic one. Because for most of human history, the water problem, as deadly as it was actually kept in check by one simple fact. People lived in small, mobile groups, spread thin across the land, and then we changed everything. When humans settled down and built villages, then towns, then dense cities, we created a brand new nightmare. Now, huge numbers of people were living crammed together, all drinking from the same limited water sources, and all, inevitably, putting their waste back into the environment around those same sources. The crowding that made civilization possible also turned waterborne disease into a vastly bigger threat. The very act of building cities supercharged the spread of the diseases that lurk in water. For thousands of years, our growing settlements were repeatedly devastated by waterborne plagues precisely because we had packed ourselves together faster than we understood how to keep our water clean. And in a strange way, that struggle is the whole story of human civilization in miniature. We solve one problem, survival in the wild, and in doing so, we create a new one, survival in the crowd. The clean water flowing from your tap today is the end result of that fight. Thousands of years of trial, error, death, observation, and slowly accumulated wisdom, culminating only relatively recently in our actually understanding the enemy, finally seeing the invisible killer under a microscope, and learning to defeat it on purpose instead of by lucky accident. And here's what I keep coming back to. We tend to think of our ancestors as simple, as helpless against a brutal world. But that's not what this story shows at all. They were facing one of the deadliest threats imaginable, an enemy they could not even perceive, and they outwitted it again and again with nothing but their senses, their fire, their patient ingenuity, and their willingness to learn from every death and remember it for the next generation. They couldn't see the enemy, so they got clever enough to beat it blind. So here's my last question for you. The next time you fill a glass from the tap, without fear, without a second thought, consider what that simple, boring act actually represents. Thousands of generations of humans who watched the water and the animals and each other, who boiled and filtered and fermented and remembered, who died in uncountable numbers, so that the survivors could pass down a little more wisdom about how to stay alive. It was paid for by the well diggers, the fire tenders, the brewers, the tunnel builders, and the grieving parents, who learned one painful lesson at a time. Every safe sip you take today was paid for long ago by people who never understood why their tricks worked, only that they did. So is a glass of clean water really an ordinary thing? Or is it one of the most hard-won victories our species has ever achieved? Handed to you so completely that you get to forget it was ever a fight at all? Let me know what you think in the comments. I genuinely want to hear it. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I'll see you soon.